Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are going to get started in just about 30 seconds. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. We are going to give folks just a few more seconds to log on before we get started. Great. We are going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Indiana Youth Institute's webinar, Updates on Youth Issues from the Legislative Session. My name is Joshua Long. I'm the Senior Educational Content Manager here at IYI. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are grateful to have the chance to connect as a community of Indiana youth workers who remain committed to meeting the needs of our youth and children. For those who are not familiar with IYI, our mission is to improve the lives of all Indiana children by strengthening and connecting the people, organizations, and communities that are focused on kids and youth. Listed here, you can see our vision that drives the work we do for Indiana and youth. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few pointers with you that will help you engage with today's webinar. For any technical support issues, use the chat feature to send a message and I will assist you. Use this feature to converse with the group as well. As a note, please make sure that the blue box next to 2 is marked as everyone so that everyone can see your comments. We also encourage you to ask questions, so please use the Q&A feature for any you may have, and we will get to as many as possible. Feel free to also upvote the great questions to the top. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar, as well as the presentation slides. Please take a few minutes to let us know your thoughts about today's presentation, and if you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk as it may have been directed there. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of participation. Like all of today's webinars, today's will be posted on our website if you'd like to revisit a portion later or share the opportunity to listen in with partners. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to our speaker for today, Mark Fairchild. Mark.
Hi, thanks for having me today to IYI, one of our favorite partners that we get to work with quite regularly. Happy to be here today to share a little bit about some issues tackled during the legislative session in this past year. I will start with a very clear disclaimer, though. There were roughly 2,000 bills covered, and unless everybody wants to be here for the next 6.5 weeks, we're going to stick to just a sampling of those so we can get a good overview of what some of the themes were throughout session. I realize that you'll have a lot of different priorities you'd love to be talking about today. There'll be my contact information at the end if you'd like to get in touch and discuss some specific ones that we're not able to go into today. First of all, I am Mark Fairchild. I'm the Executive Director of the Commission on Improving the Status of Children. You'll hear a little bit more about some of our initiatives today. But the short description is that we're a 3-branch bipartisan commission that works on children's issues across the state. And we are populated by senior leadership from the House, from the Senate, from the governor's office, from the Supreme Court, and from all the executive branch agencies that work directly with children. So we do a lot of watching over legislation, introducing some of our own, but then also looking at opportunities to improve things that are active throughout session as well. So again, we'll go through a few of those here today. Hopefully we can get some good discussion afterwards for those of you that are interested going a step further. So the ones that I'm going to really dive in today, we're going to be talking a little bit about family, youth, and caregiver engagement. And that's as it relates to House Bill 1098. So first abbreviation of the day, HB means House Bill. Shouldn't be too relevant today because technically we could call it 5 other things once it's passed into law, but these are all laws. A little bit on juvenile justice system improvement projects. That's under House Bill 1403. Looking at chronic absenteeism, a very big issue across the state that has a lot of interest and a lot of moves trying to find the right solutions there. And then looking at child welfare, family and juvenile law under a very large piece of legislation, House Bill 1605. So again, some of the highlights of session right there for you. So we'll start with House Bill 1098. This bill, everybody gets to say is their absolute favorite because, well, I wrote it. So if you find a typo, don't tell me now. House Bill 1098 was written with a very specific intent. So the Commission on Improving the Status of Children, here abbreviated as CISC, has been working on youth, family, and caregiver engagement for a number of years. We actually have two youth with lived experience directly on the commission, with full voting privileges and full voice at that level. And we've integrated within a lot of our subgroups and task force and subcommittees, those voices as well. Now, what we have found throughout that process too is that across the state, there's a lot of integration of lived experience going on, which is wonderful to see. We see that happening in a lot of different forms, most very good efforts, some efforts that are still learning and looking for places to improve, others that just need support of getting those initiatives off the ground. And that's both in nonprofits, other organizations, and state agencies. So it's great to see. But we were really looking at that saying there maybe needs to be a little bit more of a central collection point to make sure we're doing that well, especially if we're bringing in youth with lived experience. We want to treat them properly, and set a good example of how that should look and how that could look, if we're doing it well across the state. So 1098 gave the Children's Commission the ability to create and provide staff support for a statewide initiative on that youth, family, and caregiver engagement. By the way, you'll also see this written often as youth and family engagement. We've added caregiver, listening to our young folks and foster parents and others. We don't want it to seem like we're excluding any of those folks that maybe don't consider themselves family directly, but have just as big of a role. So we added that caregiver term. So this allows us to provide ongoing support for all of the youth representatives on the commission, all of our subcommittees and task force, and all the work we're already doing, just elevating that a little further. But the big item here is developing a statewide plan on youth, family, and caregiver engagement. And this will be that kind of North Star feature for our state agencies to look to and say, here is the standard that we're striving for. We're still learning a ton in this space, so this will be an evolving product, but the first drafts will be coming out next year of what those best practices really need to look like. Things like making sure youth are fairly compensated, ways to avoid tokenizing, ways to make sure that they are in charge of their role and that they're not treated like employees. All those really important aspects, we'll be developing that out. Then also through that same initiative, we'll be providing support and educational opportunities, and other experiences to increase that youth, family, and caregiver participation in state government. Those will be public-facing events where maybe we do some strategic sharing. The side of that we've looked at for professionals is what we're calling strategic listening, how to receive those that have those lived experience voices well. So really just elaborating further on some of that work in that space. And we'll be also doing that in concert with supporting state agencies and community organizations that are doing exceptional work in that space. How can we come in and complement that? It might be being able to bring in some additional experts for them. It might be just giving them a space and a forum for their different events or the different trainings that they have available. And a lot of it will be us learning from them. We've got many that have been doing it for a very long time and have been very successful. So we want to make sure there's an ongoing relationship there that we can continue striving to get better and better in this space. This bill was very popular during session. I'm happy to say final passage was 100% Republican, Democrat, House, Senate. Everybody voted in favor at every step of the way, including all the committee hearings and subsets like that. So very encouraging that we find a point of agreement to say everybody understands we need to get better at listening to Hoosier families and children, which I know it seems like something we should be saying, well, of course we're going to do that. But you know what? Putting it in writing, putting it into state law, saying that's a policy priority for our state is actually a pretty big deal and something most states don't have. I think I only saw it in 2 other states where they'd codified the need to have those lived experience voices in their state policymaking process. So really cool. And during session, it was amended by the legislature to actually add a little bit more to that. So they liked what they saw and they wanted to dig a little bit deeper. So it said, hey, in addition to making sure the Children's Commission's doing good stuff, that our state agencies are doing good stuff, that we're supporting other initiatives in the community, we want to directly reach out, or at least have a method where we can directly reach out to youth families, caregivers, and others that maybe aren't attached to any of those roles, but want to have their voice brought forward. This might be listening sessions, focus groups, some of which we've done before, but something that I think we can concentrate on a little bit more directly to say, look, you don't have to feel like you have to sign up for a big long-term role to say what's working and what's not working for you. Specifically identified in that was looking at points of complexity and inefficiency in our child serving systems. So what's slowing things down, what's making it a struggle, what's making it a point of confusion, that people that are working with our systems, as well-intentioned as our systems are able to really understand what's going on and be effective in those systems. Looking at duplication of services and places where we can consolidate. Do we have a parent or child ordered to the same 3 services 4 times in a row? Is this like the 5th diagnostic assessment we've had done for youth with special needs, when we can really say we've got the evidence, it's time to look at a proper placement? And a big one, and you'll hear me talking about this more in a different bill that we have later on, but improving time to permanency and reducing the trauma of systems involvement. So time to permanency has been a really big one, saying how do we get the youth where they can have a permanent home as expeditiously as possible. I know that's always a difficult one because we don't want to rush a decision either, but we don't want youth languishing in care. And finding that right balance point is a lot of work to do, but that'll be part of what we solicit some feedback on. And the second half of that, the trauma of systems involvement. This is something that we hear a lot, but there hasn't necessarily at a state level been a big dive into this space. So what do we mean by that? Well, some of the focus groups and listening sessions we've had over the last year will repeatedly be ones from cases that maybe were closed 10, 12 years ago. And we're talking to parents about it. And it's very clear that they're still living in the moment of what happened during that time and feeling powerless from that time and feeling like they weren't listened to from that time. And frankly, the cases where we're hearing this feedback are the good ones because they're still interested in talking to us and giving us that feedback. But we know what happens a lot of the time is system involvement is so traumatic that parents, caregivers, youth take a few steps back to say, what do I do to avoid being on the system's radar? Which, if everything's going well, that's great. If they're having new struggles, that's bad. And we don't want to have it where we're creating this environment that it was a negative experience that you never want to return to, because sometimes we'll have resources that we would love to provide for you. How do we do better in that space? So again, a very big one that we're going to be doing a lot of detailed study on. And yes, anybody that's on this call that would love to be part of that process or get feedback through any of this stuff in House Bill 1098, this is definitely an open chance to contact me afterwards and say, I'd love to be part of that discussion. We know just enough to know that we've got a lot more that we need to know. But again, a really cool piece of legislation. We've already commenced activities on this, and we have hired a staff person to be the coordinator for the engagement initiative. So we're looking forward to getting right into that as we go forward. But again, a good, positive one to start our talk with today of full unanimous support. I'll pause briefly and see if there's any questions in the chat.
Nothing yet, but this is a good reminder to use the Q&A functions for any Q&A function for any questions.
All right, thank you. And we'll have plenty of time at the end as well to go through any questions that come in. All right, going into another one that this one will feel a little bit into the weeds, but I promise you as we connect the dots between all of these, we'll get a little bit of the flow of how it comes together. So House Bill 1403, and this one is titled very vaguely Juvenile Justice Matters. This piece of legislation was designed to guide the implementation of what's known as the Youth Justice Oversight Committee. So this is a mechanism that was set up in 2022 to look at a lot of elements of juvenile justice. So developing a plan to collect and report on statewide juvenile justice data, establish policies and procedures related to screening tools and assessments, develop a statewide plan to address the provision of broader behavioral health services to children in the juvenile justice system, develop a plan for the provision of transitional services. Those are exiting Department of Corrections or other similar services. What are we doing with them then? And then developing a plan for juvenile diversion and community alternatives grants programs. So this entity created in 2022 submitted their group of plans and recommendations to the General Assembly in 2023. And with that was also discussing the need for proper funding of some of the programs and the recommendations that they made, particularly looking at juvenile diversion, community alternatives program, and behavioral health programming at the local level. So the background on that is they were awarded a large block of funding. I believe we're still around 50 million that we have available for that to say, let's work on getting some local services and supports in place for our young Hoosiers that are either in the juvenile justice system or at risk of touching into the juvenile justice system. So when we look at juvenile diversion, right, that's trying to remove them from having to go into that system in the first place. Community alternatives would be, you're at the place where you would be going into the juvenile justice system. Let's look at this option instead that at least keeps you in a community-based setting. So they did their assessment, they recommended funding, they were awarded that funding, and now they've reached the stage where they're saying, well, what do we do next? So I'll be really transparent here and say, well, they got that funding, they put out the grant opportunity statewide, and actually a very small portion of the grant funding has been allocated to date. There was not a lot of application for it, and a lot of counties did not apply for it. As much as that seems like a large block of funding that's there, that's on the table, that's available. So really, we looked at House Bill 1403 to look at some mechanics of what's working, what's not working, and why aren't we getting these funds out the door in a better way? So that gave us the chance to really dig deep into the process there. But frankly, also the process of why in general, when we have these large scale funding opportunities, do we see the small rural communities and other localities with similar demographic makeup tend to not apply for those funds? And of course, why do we see that in other ones, they have a much easier time with that? Now, some of you that have been involved with funding opportunities for a long time probably know at least a couple of the answers for this already. It's a lot of work to go for a funding opportunity. It's also a lot of work if it's held at a reporting standard that's much more akin to like some of the large scale federal grants. I say all the time that we might have a grant opportunity that you could get $50,000, but if you have to hire somebody to manage the grant and make sure those dollars get turned into a program and we have good things happening on the ground, you're going to very quickly use those funds just on the administrative end of it. So you're not going to apply. So this is really looking at what can we do better in that space. So doing detailed research and identifying recommendations to take those barriers down. That might be systemic ones, legislative barriers, data collection issues, and then also just what interventions are effective and not effective. We see a lot of communities that have something they love that they're doing, but maybe it doesn't bear fruit when we look at the data. Or they're just saying, we just need to know what some models are. We might still customize that for our local community, but we need to have a starting point. What can we do to get there so we're not spending all of our time trying to discover something or create something from scratch when there's a model that's working and available for us? How do we do better in that kind of a space? And then, of course, we're specifically looking at saying, what do we do with the needs of those rural communities with limited service capacity? So if they had all the funding in the world, it doesn't necessarily matter if you don't have the right provider base available. I know we have lots of different providers here today that can attest to some of those barriers. So what could be done differently? That's everything from investigating use of, online services and telehealth services, which is still something that I think Indiana's trying to get its hands wrapped around of how to do that well and how to keep good service integrity while doing that. But how do we make the use of the smaller provider pool that we have in certain areas while still having the best services available as broadly as possible. We also know we've got to do supportive education and outreach regarding statewide procedures, protocols, policies, and everything identified in our plans. And just saying, here's a plan, give us your best shot at what a grant program could look like under this. We need to go to them. Frankly, if they've been burned by funding opportunities that have been not great in the past or have been more work than they were worth in the past, it's pretty understandable to say they might not want to apply for what we have now. We've got to be the active component that goes out and says, here's how we can work with you to make sure you get this. And we've actually had it with several grants where we'll get an application. It's not quite there, but we'll reach out and say, let's do a review on that and see how we can get there. Have the necessary components, but also support you in building the right application. That's not to say coaching about who's going to win, who's not going to win, getting into competitive opportunities or anything like that. But instead of just outright saying, this wasn't right, try again, have at least a description of what could be done to make that a good program. So last part of that, you can see on the list, we piggybacked into that the Commission on Improving the Status of Children and that initiative that we just talked about, that we've got to make sure we integrate that into what we're doing here. Because the other part that's missing, of course, is those lived experience voices. What programs would work in your local community, what has worked, what works for you and your family, what would get your attention as something you would want to engage in, are all questions we need to be asking, because we see a lot, especially when it gets to juvenile justice, that youth and families might engage with a program just long enough to get you out of their hair, right? So what can we do better there to actually make it something that's good and useful that they want to engage with, instead of just something to say, you need to do this or else, which frankly has been the approach in a lot of areas. Plenty of areas take a much, much better approach and more preventative approach and are great models there. But how do we make sure that we're actually listening to the families, youth, and caregivers that are part of that? Beyond just doing exit surveys, which is actually the most common tool, but a tool that has a flaw, because if it's about wrapping up your services and you want out, you're more likely to give a positive review. So looking at some of those different things and how that can work going forward. So again, I'll pause for any questions on that.
Nothing yet on that, Mark.
All right, we'll keep on rolling right through. Now, one of the big issues, and this one will take us a little time to go through all the elements related to it, chronic absenteeism. So this has become a very large issue for the state. We've actually had back-to-back major bills on it. We've also had several initiatives get founded across the state diving into it. And the biggest issue has been really looking at what is chronic absenteeism. So last year there was a bill, Senate Bill 282, that really looked into at least the foundational pieces of chronic absenteeism. So when is a child chronically absent? When are they truant? And when are they a child where we need to start intervention? So that laid out a few different things. The largest piece being like, at 5 absences in a 10-week period, we should be diving in and saying what's going on that's making it difficult for you to attend school regularly. It also started the process of looking at different age groups a little bit differently. So looking at, say, when we're in the elementary school age, and a little bit into the junior high age, you're going to have different reasons and needs that relate to if the child's able to get to school. Obviously, if an 8-year-old has a transportation barrier, it's not quite as simple as getting a job and getting a car and driving themselves to school. At least we certainly hope it isn't. What else is going on there that we need to look into? Because we usually assess with a very young child, say this might be more about parent resources and potentially parent motivation, but generally more so resources as far as getting that child to school. So it broke that down a little bit separately and said, how are we going to look at that? And now that does not mean that older youth are simply making a choice to not go to school. Often they are having to be a caretaker for somebody in the home. siblings, somebody has a chronic medical need or disability, mental health issues going on, or that they frankly have to stay employed in order to make sure their home can maintain itself. So we realize a lot of different things going on in there. But that first bill really just kind of started the discussion a little bit of what are we going to do when we start seeing these things. So the school is going to hold a meeting. We'll try to get some services wrapped in there, but we'll also kind of have that both carrot and stick approach where we're now saying, look, at a certain point, we're going to have to refer this over to DCS and the prosecuting attorney's office. They'll have to decide if there's educational neglect going on here or truancy charges going on here and take the steps to relate to that. So you can see it's that balance of we want to help, but there's that end where we have to do some form of intervention into that. So that was, again, really just the start of that. It also talked about the state attendance officer, a position that I actually just changed to a new individual, Stephen Balco at Department of Education, talking about how they're going to collect data at that broader state level, where that data is going to go, and that they're going to have an open dialogue too with prosecuting attorneys, with Department of Child Services, other elements of Department of Education, to at least collect an idea of what's going on, what we're seeing with some of the large scale trends. So fast forward to Senate Bill 482, which I don't know if they just wanted to be cute with the numbering and make the next one just go up a notch. But that did a few more pieces that get closer to the meat of the problem that we're really looking at. So one, it defines what chronically absent means. This is different than truant, but saying these are our high needs attendance concerns. They may not be a truancy charge because there's a lot of things, but chronically absent means missing 10% or more of a school year for any reason. So again, not talking about truancy charges, not talking about educational neglect, but a child is having a hard time being regularly at school at least 90% of the time. So this can capture some of those intentional behaviors, also the unintentional behaviors, medical needs, mental health needs, other things going on in the family system. But we know that's a point at which we start seeing education loss if we're not intervening at what's going on. So what are we going to do as we look at that a little bit? One thing that we realized really quickly is the State Department of Education had one issue that was making it very, very difficult for them to be able to decide what interventions would be appropriate. And that is that other than categorizing as a student being present or absent, there wasn't a lot of granular breakdown data coming from the local schools in all cases. Most schools had a little bit more of their own framework of how to categorize some of those specific things. So we didn't have data that could talk nicely from the local level to the state level, which means we can't really classify interventions well between the two of them. So what do we need to do there? So a few things that they start with right away. They'll create a list of standard best practices for schools on student discipline and absenteeism. Great. At least let's have some benchmarking that would go on with what the best practices are there. And then they're going to, and they're actively doing this right now, study and prepare a report regarding the basis for the categorization of certain suspensions and expulsions. So what they're doing there is they're trying to build out that categorization framework. A student's not in school, how granular do we get as to reasons why? So in this case, suspensions and expulsions, which can be from a wide variety of issues. They could be from substance use issues, they could be from potential peer-to-peer violence issues, peer-to-teacher violence issues, and they can be just from other behavioral concerns that were disruptive to the classroom, and a lot of other things. But how do we make sure we're fully categorizing those and making sure something isn't falling into that category that maybe belongs more appropriately in another area of categorization? So next, beyond that, establishing a categorization framework for the excused absences based on the reason for the absence. So really breaking down what counts as excused, not just having present, absent, excused, unexcused, but to say, do we have everything covered that should be excused? Do we have medical absences classified correctly? Do we have all those different exceptions of what that might mean, or an educational opportunity that the parents engage the student with, other things like that. We always love to talk about civic engagement opportunities. Say if they wanted to, hey, volunteer a day of their time working with the Children's Commission and learning about that, is that going to be an excused absence? So setting that baseline. And then going from that and collecting the absence data from the local school corporations and making sure they have that posted onto the department's website. Now, the important thing is here, actually what comes next, is that from all that framework and all that categorization, that they have now developed an attendance policy model that the school corporations will adopt that have to use that statewide model as their basis. So beyond just a tiny bit of flow there saying, look, you need to be within the framework that we've established so we can collect the data well and that we can tailor interventions. Now, a big part of the discussion on this that's still unfolding too, you saw that earlier one about public reporting of chronic absenteeism. We've had issues similarly with other places where schools have collected data where they're kind of deemed as the responsible party for why that data exists. Chronic absenteeism is something that we've already looked through, right? Some of the issues that might be in play there that don't necessarily have a lot to do with the school itself. The school is the receiver of the student, hopefully a positive receiver of the student where the student would want to go there and the family would want them to go there. We realize that's not necessarily always the case, and sometimes there's a relationship issue, but there's also a lot of other things that distract from the family's ability to focus on education first and foremost. So when we look at how that information gets categorized and then reported out, are we doing it in a way that looks punitive to the individual school? So part of the discussion we're having now is saying, how do we take that and share what that data looks like as a state agency responsibility across all the agencies that are a part of that discussion? So that's something that's still evolving, but DOE so far has been very receptive to the idea of saying, yes, I mean, we're all a part of this. Child Services has part of this, Department of Health has a part of this, Mental Health and Addiction has a part of this. We all can work together on this and move that up. And also, we know we get better reporting when it's not treated as punitive to report bad data. So nobody wants to say, hey, we've got students that aren't showing up at school if it's deemed the fault of the school entirely that that's occurring. We saw this in the past with some of the bullying reporting data when it was treated as this was a negative school environment and that's why you have bullying. The reporting wasn't strong. It has improved since we looked at it more saying bullying is occurring at the school. We need a report of that so we can tailor the right services and interventions to your community, to your school, but also look at all the elements involved with that. We know social media bullying is something now that occurs 24/7 and anonymously, and in a lot of ways where it would be very difficult for the schools to be the entity in charge of regulating that. So kind of a similar thing going on here with chronic absenteeism. How do we share the load and go into that? So one other piece they added in 482 was they did allow the prosecuting attorney to conduct somewhat of an intervention meeting. So if the school's efforts are unsuccessful, they've noted and saying, well, next thing is we ask the prosecuting attorney to file an affidavit for truancy charges. Not the favorite case that the prosecuting attorney gets, not one that they love having to take to their judge and make the case for. So it says, well, when we're getting to that point, we can have a preventative meeting to talk a little bit further about possible things. So we can invite the schools to that. We can invite other stakeholders to that, family members, other caregivers throughout that system, community members that might have some programs and services, and try one more time to get things rolling. Now, this is what they call in legislative talk a may provision. The prosecuting attorney may do it. But if they do it, they've got to actually come up with a plan and some supports and an idea of what's going to go forward from that. So we know not every prosecuting attorney office is equipped to do these. Some of our counties, the prosecuting office might be the prosecuting attorney and one deputy prosecuting attorney. For doing these highly social work driven conferences, that would be kind of difficult to have the manpower to do it well. But we know other ones might say, actually, we've got a lot in place and we want to give it a shot. So this gives another tool, and also another tool that, as I was saying prior to this, shares the load of saying it's not just the school. Now, of course, prosecuting attorney is still one of those big, scary end of the line type things where the carrot versus stick element is kind of hard to discern, but it is another piece that they'll bring into play on that. It also requires public school to hold attendance conferences 10 instructional days after the 5th absence. Again, this is still pre-truancy. Usually you need 10 missed days for truancy charges to even be considered. But after the 5th absence, it was worded in Senate Bill 282 to say you got 5 days to get these meetings together. They bumped that out to 10 instructional days because frankly, 5 was not a lot of time for parents to be able to get there. Your work schedule is already planned out for the week, daycare schedules and everything else that might be in the way of that. So it bumped that out to be a little bit more reasonable. So it's instead of the school summoning you there, it's a chance to really work on the issue and not be worried about, am I gonna have a job when I get back home from this? So just a little bump out to get a little bit further away from the punitive realm of that, more towards the cooperative. Some would argue 10 days is still pretty quick turnaround, but it is an improvement if they went from 5. And a big thing that was tacked onto this, which is actually one of my favorite provisions that was passed this session, prohibits a public school from expelling or suspending a student solely because the student is chronically absent or a habitual truant. So if they've missed those 10 days in the instructional year, or if they've missed more than 10%, a school can't expel them solely for that. Now, I know for a lot of us, this makes perfect common sense saying, well, yeah, they're not coming to school. So the punishment is don't come to school anymore. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, it was still state policy that that could be done. So 482 said, let's be really clear and just end that part of the discussion. There can still be disruptive behaviors. There can be a lot of other things. There's lots of reasons why expelling or suspending might be options, but we're not going to do it just because they're not regularly showing up to school. Frankly, that just doesn't make any sense, right? So we were able to get that in play going into that and to look into it. So again, 482 really looks at better data classification, a few different places where we can start trying to get some intervention systems in place. But you can see, I mean, and some of you have probably already pointed out to yourselves mentally and saying, but this doesn't create more services to help the children and the families get back into the school setting. Very correct. And I'll point back to the last piece of legislation we looked at with 1403 that has those nice little grants for programs, including diversion. Truancy prevention would definitely be a diversion opportunity for community to look at. So, and a lot of our youth service bureaus and other community organizations already do some really solid work in truancy prevention. So even though here there's that question mark, if you were to look at this bill by itself of, well, right, but you got us referring them to support services and doing all these things, how are we going to do that? We do have a capacity building mechanism from House Bill 1403 that can be used to move in that direction. Still not going to be an overnight thing. We don't want people rushing to programming, but at least we have a little bit of a package deal that we can look at that'll get us in the right direction on that. And I will shamelessly plug too, the Children's Commission is working on a specific initiative. We're one of 5 states in the country that's part of what's called the Best Youth Initiative, where we have agency leadership as well as youth with lived experience and a parent looking on chronic absenteeism and some of the issues in there. So part of what we're doing is building reports and mechanisms and potential legislation to say, let's play matchmaker a little bit better on all of these pieces of legislation. So 1098 wants to get more youth and family voices in there. 1403 says, hey, we've got some funding. We just need to get it out there locally, especially if it's preventative. And 482 is saying, let's take some of the more punitive elements instead, make them opportunities to link families up to services, all those play nicely together if we've got the right messaging behind them going into that. So just some food for thought of how we have to look at matching that up. But again, if you have a specific interest in chronic absenteeism, the Children's Commission's got a ton going on in that space, and we'll continue to grow that out as well. Okay.
We do have
Yes,
a few questions related to the last bill. And there's enough that I think we should go ahead and answer them now, if that's okay with you.
absolutely.
So the first thing, there were two questions about this. The first is, it says point 3, 10 days after the fifth absence. Is that fifth absence unexcused absence or fifth absence? And then there's another question that says, is the attendance conference required for excused absences? So do you have clarity around excused versus unexcused as it relates to the conference?
Right. Right now, it is down as unexcused absences, but it is important to look at that point saying the classification of excused versus unexcused might be up to the local school. So there's some variation on that. So that's a good question that ties into why they're looking at better categorization framework about let's be clear which is which.
Got it. Okay, the next one is, do you have information or can you share information about how SB 482 affects children with chronic health conditions, or IEPs, I suppose?
Yes. And that is a substantial one that's been brought up kind of in the background discussion. So those are definitely ones that it's not supposed to be something that they're going down this punitive track here. But what was noted actually during some of the testimony in session is, right, but if we have a school environment where it's really hard for some of those children with special health care needs and some other IEP needs, do we still want to have some additional meetings to say, how do we get them present in the school environment as much as possible? Because if it's just a lack of not having the right resources to get them there, it's always a difficult balance of saying, there's plenty of days where home might be the better environment for them, but we also want to make sure they get to be a part of the regular school environment as much as humanly possible. So a couple of things there as they look at that reclassification, making sure that there's an understanding that special healthcare needs, IEP-driven needs, do not count as unexcused absences in any context. But also making sure that we're not missing the opportunity to provide extra supports to those families, because we don't want the IEP to just be covered to say, oh, you don't have to come to school regularly. We'll do our best to make sure you still get some kind of a quality education, knowing that that can also often turn into a lower quality education if the child's missing too many school days. So I think that's part of the balance that we'll see them looking to strike in the next 2 years of implementing 482. How do we care for them without punishing them?
Great. Next question. The question about whose role or job it is to file the truancy affidavits. The question specifically was, is it no longer the job of the school administrator to file the truancy affidavits?
Yeah, those still come through the school administrator to the prosecuting attorney's office. Though, of course, the prosecuting attorney needs to decide what's going on next with that and have a discussion with their judges. I can say, though, realistically, past the actual filing of the affidavit, it does turn into an issue of most courts don't want to pursue truancy charges. So it gets pushed back, and now it becomes a debate between the school, maybe DCS for educational neglect charges, and the prosecuting attorney's office of just passing the child around. And that's where we want to get better at having services on the ground we're referring them to instead of just seeing who's the next responsible person to take it down the punitive list.
Next question, as it relates to the bullet points on collecting certain information. Do you know what information will be collected? The question was asking specifically about will information on race be collected? But do you have information on what you'll be looking for?
Mhm. Yeah, so they're developing some of what that's going to be, but really what they're wanting to collect is whatever the local schools have regarding their absences. So however they have categorized and classified before, what they're trying to do is find what the point of commonality really needs to be. So for those schools where they don't have a clean understanding of how they categorize and go through things, and some that have very limited framework where it really is present or absent. Others, I talk with our friends in Warren Township regularly that have a whole data tracking system where they've got subcategory upon subcategory So they're collecting based on what the local school has collected. So if the school has collected some of those demographic pieces, that would be part of the package they'll ask for as they're tracking that through, because we know there are disparities in a lot of different ways and different populations. I do know in there, they are wanting to make sure they're looking specifically at homelessness, special healthcare needs, and mental health needs are some of the breakdowns on that. But anything else that the local schools have, they'll want to report that on.
Great. Next question. Is there any guidance for schools on how to remove a child or student that does not show up at the beginning of the school year?
I haven't seen them working on that guidance yet, so it'd be just within the existing policies. But yeah, to say that, what do you do with a child that isn't there for the first 20 days? What category does that go into? I haven't seen a specific gap fill within the legislation for that. So I think that'd be a good discussion to have with UE, most certainly.
Got it. The next question is from the chat. I can see in this slide that you have up that it mentions school corporations and charter schools. But regarding this and expulsion and suspension, does this include public schools, private, and charter schools?
So right now, it would be the charter schools and public schools are both qualified as public schools as far as this legislation is concerned. Private schools are still in their own space. So, but when you see charter school, this legislation is being very clear that the charter school is just a different form of public school.
Got it. And then there's one more comment question. You sort of addressed this about how this doesn't necessarily include any ways in which we're trying to keep them at school, initiatives or programs or such. And so the comment was the student problem has not been addressed. And so you talked a little bit about some things you all might do. Do you just want to offer a couple more comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, and really the biggest comment to offer there is you're right. Most of what they're doing is realizing before we get into all of the intervention pieces, we need to get our data straightened out because we don't know what's working, what's not working, what local schools are doing or not doing, what they think is a good practice versus what actually is a good practice. So we've got a long ways to go on that. And this is going to be a long-term initiative. This is not going to be find one piece of legislation that magically fixes it. But we've got to do better of really listening about what's out there, what's working, what is effective, what's not effective, and take the time to do that well. Now, I can say what is very interesting for Indiana, though, on chronic absenteeism, we are one of the best states in the country as far as where our rate is now. We're often in the top 5, if not at the worst, the top 10 in the country on where our rate is at. It is still much higher than it was pre-pandemic, but it is way ahead of some other states. So we know there are local program services and supports that are working. And this is where we have kind of a catch-22 on the home rule way that Indiana deals with education. It looks like a lot of the ability to customize services and supports locally is actually having good results. But it makes it awful for us to have to categorize and figure out what specifically is working and what's not working. So that's why we're investigating so heavily, because we're not saying that everything out there is not working and we need to do better. We're saying we got to wrap ourselves around it a little bit better and figure out what the best practices are. So the areas that are struggling, we can get some of those things in play.
Yep. Thank you for answering all of those. I think we're ready to move on to the final bill.
All right. So final bill, and I will be very clear, this is the one that's got the longest road ahead of it. So there's a lot of stuff backed into this. So I'm going to give the overview on it. I'll be clear that I'm not the best person to answer 100 questions on it because some of this is still being figured out as we go. But a very large bill from this session, House Bill 1605, was really looking at reworking a lot of elements about our family and juvenile law. Specifically, putting in code and saying that our main responsibility is the safety of the child. And I know this sounds like, well, yes, again, something that should be there. But there's always a tough balance between parents' rights and safety of the child. And this one was really trying to say, let's make sure safety of the child is at least a hair above that. So saying that parents' interest in receiving services by the state is limited. So if they're not utilizing those services well, if it's taking them a very long time, if they seem avoidant of services, we need to recognize when we need to stop those efforts. And again, making sure timely placement of children in foster care to permanent homes is a high priority. Now, again, we all know that's easier said than done. We have to have those homes available, and we have to have enough foster parents available. We need to have that right pathway for them to get from here to there. But this bill really took that overarching policy and created a very wide array of provisions aimed at improving time to permanency, again, that we talked about earlier, such as establishing some new deadlines and limiting the duration of specific reunification services. So a lot of what you see here is reacting to those very long cases that may be 3, 4, 5 years or more in care. We don't have a permanent placement for the youth. How can we do better in that space while still making sure we give some appropriate ability for the birth parent to reunify, but without causing additional harm to the child? So a few things in there. And again, I could spend 3 hours on this bill because there's a lot of different pieces in there. It does provide an individual with whom the child is placed during CHIN's proceedings, child in need of services proceedings, is entitled to attend in their entirety all the different hearings that are a part of that. This usually is going to be maybe your family caregiver person or your foster parent. Basically saying they're allowed to be there and have information, and then make sure that any information they have can be heard as well. It also provides the court shall allow an individual providing care and supervision of a child as a foster parent, long-term foster parent, or kinship caregiver is part of the CHIN's proceeding and can intervene as a party. So they can actually actively participate in that and act as an intervener up to and including looking at becoming the permanent placement. Now, that is after a certain amount of time. It's not something that we say, hey, you've been with them for a week and a half, off you go. But it does require that all the other things for reunification have expired. Usually we're looking well after a year of placement time before this could happen. Provides the rights of the child, parents, guardian, custodian, guardian ad litem, as parties proceeding include discovery, subpoena, examination of witnesses, presentation of evidence. So right here on this screen, these are some of the slightly more, I'll say, controversial elements of this bill. You can see that it allows the foster parent or some of the other groups that are part of the CHINs or TPR proceedings, termination of parental rights, proceedings to say, well, we want to give our own side of it. And we want to make our own case in it. And we want to make sure we're there and listening to all of it. So the positive end of this would be like if those are folks that are looking at potential long-term placement with the youth, they're active and involved and they're able to be right there in court saying that. The potential downside, of course, is adversarial systems. Do we want the foster parent to get directly adversarial with the birth parent? And is that going to be positive for the child? Right. So I don't have an answer for you on that one today. I know there's always a push to say, hey, if we have a great person lined up and ready to take this child and we have parents that are what we think dragging their feet or not moving as fast through services as we would like for them to, let's just get moving. But are we making sure we're doing that in the right way and giving a parent that maybe is going through some form of addiction recovery the time to do that appropriately? So this is a very tough balance. It gets asked about constantly of what is the magic balance here. And this bill tries to get a little bit closer to finding that out. Now, I said I am not the expert on this bill because there are about 5,000 different little state agency policies that went into this one. But it is something to be acutely aware of, that we're trying to move closer to child safety being the tipping point versus parents' rights. And we're also looking at getting the child into a long-term placement as quickly as possible as being a priority. Again, still with safety first in mind. So that balance is changing a little bit from what we've seen in probably the last 10 years or so of child welfare policy in the state of Indiana. How this unfolds will be up a lot to Department of Child Services, the juvenile justice and the court system, and some of the family courts as well. So it's more about 1605, a lot in there to watch and see what goes next, and how that will unfold. Because again, a lot of policy change here, that has to probably go through a few cases before we see what's really going to look like on the ground. But it does have that time to permanency element that, through our other bills and through the Children's Commission, we've always said, how do we get the child in the right place as soon as it makes sense to get them into the right place? So there's a definite point of agreement there. Now, how do we make sure we have enough good quality foster parents? How do we make sure we've got adoptive parents, especially for those 12, 13, 14-year-olds? How do we have a system that's ready to receive those kids when they are ready to move to something that's their best placement might not be with their birth parent? And that's still going to be the question mark here. It doesn't solve that. It has a lot of optimism that hopefully more people stand up and want to be that person. I share that I would love to have that happen as well. But we've got a lot of seeing what the future holds for some of the provisions in 1605. Probably something we'll see, fixes coming out and different changes, over the next 3-4 years as they take the ideas in 1605 and try to turn into something a little bit more tangible in practice. All right, that is all of my bills for today. I know as anticipated, 4 bills still took about an hour there, so you can see it's a very deep session this year. I realize I didn't probably get to near a tenth of the bills other people are interested in. But again, feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out about ways to get involved with the Children's Commission, specifically our youth engagement and family engagement work. We love connecting those voices. Our strategic planning is starting up, for next year in January. We'll have a new plan. So even if you've got ideas of areas where our commission could focus, send those my way. We want to make sure we have a good open discussion there. So I'll pause and see if we have any final questions.
Yeah, as I'm pulling up my final slides, there was one question, if you could answer it quickly. Regarding school absenteeism, if they have an intervention program aimed at addressing the issue, is there a place to apply for state grants for the program?
Yeah, when we're looking at, and I referenced the Youth Justice Oversight Committee and the grant funds that are working through that, you would actually look with the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute. They are the entity, that is managing those grants. And I believe there is a cluster of them that just opened up now. They'd be categorized as diversion, community alternatives, as behavioral health. So you find which bucket fits for the program you're looking at doing. And you can look at how to make an application do that. And their process will guide you through the whole thing. So the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute, check for the grant opportunities off of their website, or feel free to reach out to me if you have any difficulty finding that.
Great, thank you for that. And just as a reminder, I will be sending out the slides at the end. That includes Mark's email. So as we conclude this webinar, I first want to thank you, Mark, for the overview of the new legislation. Obviously, there's a lot of legislation that affects youth, but we appreciate the hour that you gave to us today. And so with the last minute or 2 minutes, I'm going to bring a few events to your attention. The first is IYI's 2025 College and Career Readiness Regional Conferences, focused on the key role community partnerships play in supporting the educational and workforce success of youth. This year's regional conferences bring together professionals from youth-serving organizations, school counselors, educators, business leaders, and community partners to explore how strong collaborations can create lasting impact on college and career readiness. With identical speakers and content in each venue, you're free to choose the date and location that suits your schedule best. You can register at iyyi.org/events. With that, in addition to our regional conferences, we also have a number of other exciting events in August, including a College and Career Connects in Clark, Union, and Wayne counties, as well as 2 additional webinars. And the easiest and best way to stay up to date with opportunities that we have is to sign up for our newsletter, iyyi.org/newsletter. That comes out every Friday. It's a short read with a lot of great information. And so as we conclude, I want to thank all of the attendees for being with us today. We appreciate your impact, voice, and choice to learn and partner with us. This afternoon, you will receive an email that includes a copy of the presentation and a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about today's presentation, and upon completion, you will be redirected to your certificate. If you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk as it may have been directed there. And so that concludes our presentation. And so one more time, thank you so much for showing up today and every day for kids in Indiana.